When I was a teenager, I loved exploring abandoned places with my best friend, Anna. There was something thrilling about slipping past the barricades, stepping into the unknown, and feeling the heavy breath of history in the air. We had explored old factories, crumbling houses, and forgotten graveyards, but there was something about Blackwater Asylum that intrigued us more than any other place. The asylum was nestled on the outskirts of Blackwater, Pennsylvania, a town known for its tragic history and abandoned landmarks. I remember the first time we saw the asylum from a distance. The towering, Gothic structure loomed like a giant out of a nightmare, dark windows staring like hollow eyes. We heard whispers about the place, rumors of dark experiments, tortured souls, and ghosts that never left. Some said the building was cursed. Others swore it was haunted by the souls of patients who had died under cruel and inhumane treatment. One autumn evening, with the wind crisp and sharp in the air, we decided to break in. Anna was always the braver of the two of us, and her enthusiasm was contagious. We managed to sneak past the rusted gates, creeping through the overgrown yard until we found a broken window at the back of the building. The glass was jagged, the edges sharp like teeth, but we climbed through anyway, our hearts pounding with excitement. Inside, the asylum was a decaying maze of corridors and abandoned rooms. The scent of mildew, rotting wood, and stale air hung in the atmosphere, thick enough to taste. Every step we took echoed through the empty hallways. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and some rooms had been ransacked. Papers scattered across the floor, old furniture overturned, and dust-covered windows letting in just a sliver of moonlight. It felt like we had stepped into a place suspended in time. As we wandered deeper, I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. There was something unsettling about it, a stillness that wasn't quite right. At first, I chalked it up to nerves, the thrill of being somewhere forbidden. But soon, Anna found something that would change everything. Tucked into a dark corner of the nurse's station was an old, dusty journal. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed and fragile. Anna eagerly flipped through the pages, her fingers tracing the faded ink. It belonged to a nurse named Lila. The journal was filled with frantic, desperate scribbles, confessions of guilt, despair, and a warning. Lila had worked at the asylum during its darkest days, witnessing unspeakable horrors. The patients, she wrote, were not just victims of neglect. They were tortured by something far worse. She had failed them, and in her guilt, she believed a curse had been placed on the asylum. The patients had never left, their souls trapped, and they were coming for her. I thought it was all just ramblings, the product of a mind pushed to the edge by the atrocities she had witnessed. But there was something about the way Anna read those words, something that made the air feel heavier. I remember her face paling as she muttered, "This doesn't feel right." Then it started. At first, it was faint, a barely audible sound, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. We froze, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was as if voices were calling out from the depths of the building, begging for attention, for help. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but something inside me recoiled. We pushed forward, deeper into the bowels of the asylum, unable to shake the feeling that we were not alone. The shadows shifted in ways that made no sense, and as we passed an old hallway, I saw something that made my heart stop. A pale figure in a bloodstained nurse's uniform stood at the end of the hall. Her face was white as porcelain, her hair black and wet, hanging around her like a shroud. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring into mine. I couldn't breathe. It felt like my chest was being crushed by an invisible force. Then, without warning, the figure let out a low, guttural moan. It was like the sound of a soul in torment, a sound that crawled under my skin. Before I could react, Anna grabbed my arm, pulling me forward. "We have to go. Now," she whispered, her voice shaking. We ran. We turned corners, raced down hallways, our footsteps echoing like thunder in the silence. But no matter how fast we ran, the asylum seemed to stretch and twist, the hallways never ending. The walls seemed to close in on us, and the whispers grew louder, closer. It was like the asylum itself was alive, trapping us inside. I looked back, and that's when I realized Anna was no longer beside me. My heart skipped a beat. Panic surged through me as I called her name. But the only answer was the sound of my own voice echoing back at me. "Anna!" I screamed, stumbling through the maze of rooms. Room after room, I searched, growing more desperate with each passing second. The asylum seemed to be shifting, as if it were mocking my efforts. I found her finally, standing in the middle of an old operating room, her back to me. Her body was stiff, her movements robotic. She didn't respond when I called her name. Her eyes were wide open, but they weren't looking at anything. They were staring into nothingness. And then I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 lifetimes of sorrow. "You failed them, Anna." I turned around, but there was no one there. The voice continued, "You failed them all. You must pay." I grabbed Anna, shaking her, trying to pull her away, but she didn't move. Her skin felt cold to the touch. I could feel something pulling at me, something invisible, but I couldn't let go of her. I dragged her out of that room, out of the asylum, even as the walls seemed to scream in protest. The fresh air hit us like a slap in the face when we finally made it outside. I thought we had escaped, but Anna wasn't the same. She didn't speak for days after that night, and when she did, her eyes were distant, haunted. She began to withdraw from me, as though something inside her had snapped. A few weeks later, Anna disappeared, just vanished. No sign of a struggle, no note, no trace. She was gone. Years passed. The asylum eventually burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. The fire was fast, almost unnatural, as if it was trying to erase the past completely. The building was reduced to charred ruins, but locals still speak of it on stormy nights. They say they hear faint screams carried by the wind, and that if you look carefully, you can see two figures wandering among the ashes, one in a blood-stained nurse's uniform, the other clutching a dusty journal. I never went back to Blackwater, but I know the curse isn't over. It waits for the next soul to enter the asylum's decaying walls, ready to claim another victim. I should have never opened that journal. Years after my childhood, I returned to Fernhill Manor, my family's old estate, to help care for it. The mansion was vast, hidden within a thick forest, offering tranquility and isolation. But each evening, I noticed a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees, staring toward the house. At first, I assumed it was a wild animal or just my imagination. However, the figure grew bolder, slowly inching closer to the house every night. I was alone, save for the aging caretaker, Mr. Thorne, who had been with the family for decades. He rarely spoke of the past, and I could see why. Every time I mentioned the figure, his face tightened with a mixture of fear and reluctance, as though speaking about it might make it real. But how could it not be? I had seen it. The tall, spectral shape, always distant, yet always watching. One evening, as the shadows grew longer and the sun sank behind the trees, I decided I had had enough. I couldn't keep pretending it was nothing, or worse, that I was imagining it. I gathered my courage and set out toward the edge of the forest, the place where I had first noticed the figure standing. The ground beneath my feet was soft, the damp earth squishing with every step. A cold breeze swept through the trees, carrying the scent of decay. It felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As I approached the line of trees, my heart pounded. The figure was there, standing in the same spot as before, but this time closer, more defined in the fading light. Its form was tall and hunched, clothed in tattered, dark garments, and its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, casting a shadow over its features. It held something in its hands, something long and metallic, gleaming faintly even in the dim light. I stopped, frozen in place. It had noticed me. Its head turned ever so slightly, the motion slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to move. Then, without warning, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, as though it had melted into the trees themselves. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow and my body stiff with fear. Was it gone? Had I just imagined it? I couldn't trust my mind anymore, not with the way the shadows danced in the corner of my eyes. But the fear was real, and it gnawed at me from the inside out. I stumbled back toward the manor, but the image of the figure stayed with me, lingering in my thoughts. The next morning, I sought out Mr. Thorne, hoping to understand what I had seen, or at least find a rational explanation. He was tending to the garden when I approached him, his back hunched with age and his hands rough from years of labor. When I mentioned the figure in the forest, his face grew pale, his eyes wide with an almost childlike fear. "You saw him," Mr. Thorne said, his voice low and shaking. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jebediah, the first owner of Fernhill Manor," he muttered. "A vengeful spirit, if ever there was one. He disappeared years ago, vanished without a trace, but his curse still haunts these woods." I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. A curse? A vengeful spirit? Mr. Thorne told me a tale that chilled me to the bone. Jebediah Blackwell, the original owner of Fernhill Manor, had built the estate with his own hands, amassing great wealth. But his fortune came at a cost. He was a cruel man, notorious for his greed and disregard for human life. It was said he made a pact with dark forces to ensure his success, using the land's power for his own gain. His greed, however, was his undoing. He had wronged someone, no one knew who, and the spirit of that person had returned to take its vengeance. Jebediah vanished one stormy night, and the manor was abandoned soon after. But it was never truly empty. The spirit lingered, and it took on the form of Jebediah himself, returning each year to haunt the place. Mr. Thorne said the figure I had seen was a manifestation of that spirit, a shadow of a man cursed to walk the earth for all eternity. I didn't know what to believe. I had always thought of my family's estate as a place of peace, a refuge from the world. Now it felt like a tomb, a prison of the past. But I couldn't ignore what I had seen. The figure wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. The next night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The power cut out without warning, plunging the manor into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my pulse quickening. There, standing in the same spot as before, was the figure, much closer now. It held a rusted pitchfork, its tip gleaming menacingly in the moonlight. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It began to move, slowly at first, then faster, closing the distance between us. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the temperature dropped. I could feel the chill in my bones, an unnatural cold that seeped into my skin. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the earth beneath me. I could hear it behind me, the soft scrape of the pitchfork against the ground, the breathless shuffling of its footsteps. The manor was too far away, and the woods too thick. I had no place to hide, but I didn't stop. The overgrown garden loomed ahead, the crumbling gazebo in the distance offering the only chance for shelter. I ducked beneath its decaying beams, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breath. The sound of footsteps came closer, then stopped. I held my breath, praying the figure hadn't seen me, that it would leave. But the air grew heavier, and I could feel its presence just outside the gazebo, watching. I waited for what felt like hours, my body frozen in place, every muscle tense with fear. Finally, the footsteps faded, and the figure was gone. The next day, I found that the main entrance had been sabotaged. The door, once sturdy and solid, was now jammed with a metal spike. The wood splintered and cracked. It was as though someone had tried to keep me inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that the curse of Fernhill Manor was far from over. The figure, Jebediah, or whatever it truly was out there, watching, waiting for the next soul to fall victim to its wrath. I wondered how many others had met the same fate, trapped in the manor's grip, unable to escape the curse that clung to it like a suffocating fog. I couldn't stay, not with the growing sense of dread that hung over the estate. But as I drove away, leaving the towering spires of the manor behind me, I couldn't help but feel that it wasn't truly over. The curse had taken root long ago, and it would never let go. The figure would return, as it always had, to haunt Fernhill Manor. And I would never forget the darkness that had once been my family's home.